Look, if you've spent any amount of time in Taylor Sheridan's universe, and at this point, there are enough shows that doing so is basically a part-time job, you already know the rhythm. Things get nice for about 30 seconds. Someone has a meaningful conversation in front of fire or a mountain range, and then the floor drops out. Episode 3 of Dutton Ranch, titled Act of God Business, is very much operating inside that tradition. But here's the thing. It's also doing something a little different. It's pulling back. It's slowing down. And if you go in expecting the same raw velocity as Episode 2, you're going to be surprised, possibly disappointed, possibly relieved, depending on your constitution. So let's get into it, because there's actually quite a bit worth unpacking here, even if the episode itself isn't exactly burning the barn down. The first thing worth establishing is what Act of God Business is not. It is not an episode that advances every plot thread simultaneously. In fact, a surprising number of the show's bigger storylines are essentially placed on hold for the hour. Rob doesn't appear. Rip, having dropped Wes's body on someone else's land, a choice that felt enormously consequential last week, isn't even mentioned. And Whitney, who has essentially been functioning as the emotional and narrative engine of the entire 10-petal storyline, is absent from the episode almost entirely. Now, some viewers are going to find that frustrating. Totally understandable. But what Sheridan is doing here is actually something he did quite effectively in the early seasons of Yellowstone. He's using a slower episode to do character work, to add texture, to let you spend time with people before everything inevitably goes sideways. And if you appreciate that approach, Episode 3 rewards you for it. What you're left with essentially are two primary storylines, one following Rip out on the range, and one following Beth all the way to Dallas, plus a handful of smaller threads that are doing more work than they might initially appear to be doing. Let's start with Beth, because her arc in this episode is probably the most entertaining 20 minutes of the hour. The premise is fairly simple. Beth has secured an audience with a high-end hotel chain in Dallas, and she is bringing 3 of the finest steaks Dutton Ranch can produce to make her case. As a sales pitch, it is exactly as bold and slightly unhinged as you would expect from Beth Dutton, and it works, or at least, it works right up until the moment the Jackson family decides to make themselves a problem. Because Joaquin follows her to Dallas. And if you were wondering whether this man was going to be content to wage his family's war exclusively on home turf, this episode answers that question pretty definitively. He makes his presence known in the kind of understated, threatening way that this show has always done well. It's not loud, it's not explosive, but there's something about the dynamic that makes you feel like the clock has started on something Beth can't quite see yet. Beth, to her credit, is not rattled. She compares Joaquin to Jamie, which is an absolutely brutal thing to say to someone's face, and she means every syllable of it. But even she seems to register on some level, just barely, that this particular opponent might require a different strategy than the one she's used before. Joaquin isn't Jamie. Jamie was family. And whatever Joaquin is, he's got fewer reasons to hold back. Meanwhile, back on the ranch, literally Rip is dealing with a crisis that is at once completely mundane and actually catastrophic in its implications. Foot and mouth disease, FMD, in the herd. Now, if you're like me, your first reaction is probably something along the lines of, wait, is that still a thing? And apparently, yes, it absolutely is, and Rip's reaction to discovering it tells you everything you need to know about how serious the situation is. He calls Everett to confirm what he's seeing. That alone should tell you he's not taking any chances. What FMD means, practically, is that the herd has to be quarantined. Rip and the hands essentially set up camp with the cattle for several days, try to determine how far the disease has spread before it can be contained. It is unglamorous, uncomfortable work, and Sheridan depicts it as such. There's no romanticism to it. It's just men doing a hard thing because it has to be done, which is, if we're being honest, kind of the thesis statement of everything Sheridan has ever written. By the time Beth returns home at the end of the episode and sees a cow and her calf dead in the field, the implication is pretty clear. The quarantine hasn't worked, or at least, it hasn't worked well enough. The herd is likely going to take serious losses from this. And when you consider that the ranch is still recovering from the fire, that this is damage on top of damage, it starts to feel less like a setback and more like a siege. Here is where the episode earns its slower pace. I think, because Zachariah's backstory is genuinely one of the more interesting character reveals the show has done so far. A woman named Anna Dupree arrives at the ranch with a firearm and a very specific target in mind, and Rip has to physically intervene to stop her from shooting Zachariah on the spot. In the moment, it's dramatic. In retrospect, after Zachariah explains himself around the campfire that night, it becomes something more complicated. He killed Anna's daughter, not in cold blood, not in a fight, but by reversing into her while he was drunk behind the wheel. An accident, yes, but one that was entirely the product of choices he made. And that distinction between accident and negligence, between bad luck and bad judgment, is exactly the kind of moral gray area that Sheridan loves to operate in. Everett's read on Zachariah is that he's a decent man who has done genuinely terrible things. And Rip, to no one's surprise, finds that description broadly applicable to most people he knows, including himself. It's one of those quiet fireside exchanges that this franchise does better than almost anything else on television. Two people talking plainly about guilt and consequence, and whether redemption is even a coherent concept, and it lands. What it also does is raise the question of what Anna Dupree does next. She didn't get what she came for. That's not typically how people like her end the story. Then there's Beulah, who gets some of her most revealing screen time yet in episode 3, and it is not flattering, which is exactly the point. At the funeral of the outgoing sheriff, she crosses paths with both Everett and Sheriff Wade. The conversation with Wade is the more interesting one, because it crystallizes something about Beulah's character that has been hovering at the edges of the show since the premiere. She genuinely believes that because she bankrolled Wade's election campaign, she owns him. Not metaphorically, actually owns him. She speaks to him the way someone speaks to a piece of property they're starting to find inconvenient. Wade, for his part, is visibly done with it. He's been willing, or at least has appeared willing, to look the other way on some of what the Jackson family gets up to. That much is now confirmed. But there's a ceiling on how much of this he's prepared to absorb, and Beulah seems congenitally incapable of recognizing where that ceiling is. My read is that Wade ends up being an unlikely asset for Beth and Rip before this season is over. Not because he's a good person in any uncomplicated sense, but because Beulah is going to push him past whatever threshold he has left. And when that happens, he'll need somewhere to turn. The Duttons have historically been very good at being the option people turn to when all the other options have burned down. We also learned something important in this episode. Beulah herself answers to someone. We don't know who. We don't even get a strong hint about who. But the way it's framed, the slight contraction in her posture, the momentary shift in her voice, suggests that whoever it is, they're not someone she takes lightly. That thread is going to matter. And then there's Carter and Oreana. And I'll be honest with you, this is the part of the episode that is generating the most anxiety for me personally. Carter is, at his core, a kid who wants to be seen. That's always been his thing. And Oreana, who is very much a Jackson, whatever her individual feelings about her family might be, has zeroed in on that with the kind of precision that should be setting off alarms for everyone around him. By the end of this episode, they are well beyond just flirting. They are in genuinely complicated territory. The obvious hope was that Beth was going to walk in on them. Not because that would be comfortable, but because Beth's intervention would at least constitute some kind of circuit breaker. Instead, the dead cows command her attention, as they command everyone's attention, and Carter's situation stays unresolved and quietly worsening. Here's my concern. Oreana may genuinely like Carter. That's almost worse, because even if her feelings are real, she is still a Jackson. She still exists inside a family structure that is openly at war with the Duttons. And Carter, who is technically under Beth's care, is walking directly into the middle of that war without quite understanding that the ground under him has already been mined. So that's act of God business. It's quieter than the episodes flanking it. It's doing foundational work rather than fireworks. But the best seasons of Yellowstone were built on episodes exactly like this one. Hours that seemed like they were treading water right up until the moment you realized you were 3 feet from the edge. The herd is sick. Beth has a new enemy in Dallas. Zachariah has unfinished business following him. Beulah answers to someone we haven't met yet. And Carter is making choices that are going to cost someone dearly before this season finds its ending. Dutton Ranch is playing the long game. Episode 3 is proof of that. Whether the payoff justifies the patience, we'll find out together. Thanks for watching.